Okay, everybody, welcome to TESOL 2250. This is week 11, day 2. And in this short video, I'm going to talk a little bit about register. What is register? And then the related idea of code switching and what that is, and why we use different registers. So we're going to talk a lot about some specific examples of different registers, and I'm going to show you some videos of different registers throughout the next couple of weeks. So we'll be on this topic for a while. So let's talk about what is register. So this is any form of a language that you use for a particular purpose. In other words, we always adapt our language depending on our audience and our context. Register can also refer to the level of formality that we use in our language. And this can apply to a variety of different changes that we make, such as changes in pronunciation, changes in vocabulary, and different kinds of grammatical constructions that we might choose to use. Okay, so there's several examples of registers, and sorry, the text labels didn't come out here, but you'll just have to follow along with me, and I'll see if I can add them so they're visible on the slide. We can start at the very top, and you'll see this picture here of a church service. Now, a church service is indicative of what we call the frozen or static register. And the reason this is because, when you think about, for example, reciting Bible verses or some other sacred text, there is a particular form of the language that's used, especially in much older transliterations of sacred texts, that we wouldn't normally use in day-to-day speech. And this is rather invariable. And this is true not just of religious texts, but also religious ceremonies. There might be a particular way that a priest or clergy or pastor goes about saying a few sentences as a ritual, but these are what we call frozen because they tend to be they tend to not change very frequently. And so this is one particular example of a register. Now, another type of register that's indicated by this picture here on the bottom middle is an example of what we call a formal register. So when we think about a formal register, this is like the register you'd use to write an academic paper in APA format or something like that. Or if you're giving a talk at a conference, you're going to use a particular register, say with people who are also experts in that same field, that you may not necessarily use, if you're talking to your friends or you're talking to your grandma. And so we make all of these choices, not only dependent on the context we're in, but also, when we're talking to people of different ages, we vary our register a lot. With the way that we talk to a child would not be the same way we talk to an adult. And in fact, it's kind of comedic, and it has been used comedically when you see an adult talking to a child as if they're another adult, or vice versa. So far we have the static register that we can kind of represent with like the church service. And then we have the formal register, which we can represent with the conference. The next one that we see here is what we call the consultative register. You see a doctor consulting with a patient. And this is a slightly less than formal register, but still a little bit more formal than what we would use when we're talking just to our friends. So, these kinds of things are exemplified by maybe how a doctor and patient might speak, or if you are the patient, how you might speak to your doctor. Now, finally, and the one that we probably use the most frequently, is this informal register, which I have represented by these two friends that are talking. The informal register is the register you probably use with your peers and maybe some of your family members if they're not children. And it's kind of the language of everyday conversation. We also have the intimate register here, and this is a register shared between, say, spouses or partners. And this is going to be obviously very different than the way that we talk to our peers and our comrades. So in all of these instances, let's say, for example, I'm going to give you an example of this because you're going to do this for a discussion board assignment this week. In your discussion board assignment, I asked you to make a video of yourself and try to speak in 3 different registers. I wanted you to try to speak in the formal register, and then try to speak in the consultative register, and also try to speak in the informal register about the same topic. So the example that I'm going to use is I hurt my arm a few months ago. Actually, this was last year. And if somebody were to ask me, what happened to your arm? I'm going to reply with 3 distinct registers. Let's start with the formal register. What happened to my arm? Well, I had been running, and I looked at a car with a funny license plate. It was very comical, and it distracted me, and I didn't see a raised portion of the sidewalk. I tripped over that portion, and I incurred multiple lacerations and contusions on my left arm over the ulna bone of my left arm. So that is an example of what we would probably say is more of a formal register that I used. Notice I used some very specific terminology there. My ulna bone, this is this bone here in my left arm. I point specifically to the left arm. I used words like contusion or laceration, which are not words that most people in informal conversation would necessarily understand. So that's my example of a formal register. I'm talking about what happened to my arm. Now, for your discussion board post, you're going to comment on the difference between that description that I just gave and the next description, which is going to be the consultative description. And finally, the final description, which is going to be the informal register. So once again, what happened to my arm? Well, I was running and I saw a funny license plate on a car passing me by. And, there was a raised section of the sidewalk, and I tripped and I fell. And I hurt my arm really badly. And, I slid on the sidewalk a little bit, and I got a lot of bruises and cuts and scrapes. So I want you to think about the difference between that description that I just gave to my doctor and the more academic style description that I gave with the formal register. What was the difference? What vocabulary did I use that was different in the second example than in the first example? And feel free to take some notes. If you want to post your observations on this discussion board about my video, you're welcome to do that, or you can do it for your classmates' videos. Either one is fine. Okay, so we're going to go to the last register that I'm going to use here, and that is the informal register. I'm just talking to a friend now. What happened to my arm? Well, I was jogging and saw this really funny license plate. And I totally got distracted, wasn't paying attention. I had no idea what I was doing. And then I stopped looking down at the ground, and there was a raised portion of the sidewalk, and I tripped and totally biffed it. I mean, it was bad. And yeah, I slid a couple of feet on the sidewalk on my elbows, and I totally scraped the hell out of it. So that's my example of me talking to a friend. And I want you to just comment on what words did I use differently? Did I pronounce things a little bit differently? Did I use different grammatical constructions? Did I use slang? All of those things are going to constitute the informal register. So please write your observations of those 3 examples of register that you just saw, starting with the formal register, the consultative register, and the informal register. Now, if you'd like to use that for your discussion board post, you're more than welcome to do that, okay? Otherwise, you can just look at your partner's or your classmates' discussion board post of the same thing and write your observations of the differences there. Remember, I want you to focus on grammatical constructions that are different and write down the specific sentences. Also, look at pronunciation, and also if there's any types of words or slang that are used or not used, I want you to note that as well. So what I did just a minute ago in going between those different registers is something called code switching. Now, code switching is when you make the active choice to alternate between either different languages or different dialects within the same languages, or within different registers to go back and forth. So again, me describing what happened to my arm to 3 different people or 3 different groups of people is an example of code switching. So we're going to see lots and lots of examples of code switching, specifically within dialects, since this is structure and varieties of English. We're going to look at a lot of different dialects and varieties, and we're going to see people code switching between them. And we're going to ask ourselves, what's prompting the code switch? What's making them switch between one dialect or register and another? So why do we use different registers? Why do we do this? Well, in many cases, we want to be understood. If we're in a context or an environment where everybody's using one register, let's say the informal register, and you're using the formal register, nobody's going to understand you. So in this case, if we want to be understood, we might switch registers. We also use different registers to gain an understanding of how people form or perceive the form of the language that we use. Let's say, for example, I walk into an overtly formal register setting, and I decide I want to use the informal register. Now, we're going to see if that makes people kind of bristle, and maybe they're a little bit uptight, and they think, oh, gosh, she shouldn't be using that informal register. That seems a little weird. Or if maybe everybody relaxes and they're like, oh, okay, good. Now I can talk the way I want to talk instead. So, we want to know how people perceive the form of the language that we use. And another big reason why we use different registers is to put our audience at ease. And this is what sociolinguists call accommodation. When we accommodate to the register that people are using around us, or the dialect that people are using around us, a lot of times it makes our audience feel a little bit more comfortable if that's the dialect or register that they're using. On the other hand, we may also choose to keep a certain register that is different from the context that we're in to make a statement, right? If we want to show that we are a part of a certain group that uses a certain register, and maybe we don't like that there's a certain formality to registers in the context that we're in, we might choose to actively make a statement by using an informal register. And related to that idea is that we often want to try to show we're connected, we're an in-group connection to somebody. So when you mark your register differently than the people you're talking to, sometimes you're perceived as being outside of the group. The opposite is also true. If you can use the right register with a group, then the group thinks that you're one of them. And so we're going to get into a lot of very specific examples of that over the next couple of weeks. But that was just a very basic idea of what are different registers. We saw a few different examples of registers, 5 different examples of registers, in fact. And also we talked about the concept of code switching. All right, so thanks very much for listening. And I will see you all on Friday.